Hi, and welcome to this first Sociology remote learning lesson. This is hopefully going to be the next best thing to us actually being in the same room as one another. The advantage of this is that you can have the lesson and you can hear my dulcet tones without actually having to leave your own home. Also, if you get a little bit bored of me, you could pause the video or you could just switch me off and come back to it later on. You will need, for this lesson, I sent it to you via email, and it's on class charts, and there's also a Google Documents link to it in the description of this video, but you'll need the lesson notes template that goes with this. Now you can either print that off and you can make your notes as you go along, or you can type into it and keep it as an electronic document that you save and print out later on. The other resources that you need for the lesson I will have sent alongside that particular document, and furthermore, sometimes during the course of these lessons there'll be a little clip that you need to open and look at, and a video link which is not attached to this particular video. So I suggest that you have me open in one web browser. You have the resources that you need either in front of you physically, or you have them open on your desktop, and then you have another little window open and you can go to any clips and paste in the URL links that are inside the notes template, so that you can follow the lesson as we go along. Hopefully this is going to make the learning remotely a little easier. It's the next best thing to us actually being in the room together, and until we can be in the room together again, then I will try and teach you in this way. So without further ado, let's begin. Okay, so the three crime and deviance, or the three theories of the sociology of crime and deviance that we've looked at so far are functionalism, subcultural theory, and Marxism. Now, what all of these theories have in common is they provide some sort of explanation to try and ascertain why people commit crime. So for functionalism, crime serves a function. If you're Merton, strain theory, crime is because you're trying to get to the American dream, you're trying to attain something maybe that you can't do through legitimate means. If you're a Marxist, then crime is criminogenic. Capitalism exists, therefore crime exists, because people are exploited, and people of a lower social class often have no choice but to get involved in criminal activity. Subcultural theory looks at the different norms and values that especially young working class males have. They form subcultures so that they can get some status, or they can get some affirmation in a way other than legitimate means, through education, through a job, etc., etc. What we're going to have a look at today is labeling theory, and what sets labeling theory apart is that, unlike those first three theories that I've just talked about, labeling theory does not seek to answer the question, why do people commit crime? They aren't trying to explain why crime is committed in the first place. They're trying to understand why people are labelled in a certain way, and to understand how that label can then have an influence on the person who is labelled, and how that in turn can help us to understand why certain things are labelled as criminal or deviant and certain things aren't. So whereas the first three theories, functionalism, Marxism, subcultural theory, are trying to answer that question, why do people commit crime, what labeling theory is trying to answer the question to is, why are people labelled, and what's the impact of that label? So in a moment you're going to pause me, you can have a look at your notes template booklet. You've got 4 or 5 images there, and it asks you to think about how those people might be labelled. What's your initial impression of these people just based on the image of them that you see? And just jot down next to those images how you might label that person or those people. That might be a positive or a negative label, or it might be quite a neutral label, and then we'll talk about the impact that might have on that individual. So if you pause me now and have a little go at that task. Okay, welcome back. I am guessing that if we think about two of the images that you might have jotted something down next to, if we think about the priest and we think about the young people with the hoods up, the last image, I'm guessing that you labelled the priest in a way which suggests that that person is quite disciplined, authoritative. They have a place in society that is trusted, and the priest is responsible for caring for people. The priest is responsible for educating people, etc. I'm guessing that you labelled the young people differently. You may have labelled them as gang-like, you may have labelled them as trouble. In the same way as I'm guessing that you probably labelled the model, the girl who was modelling, you might have labelled them differently to, say, the punk with the big Mohican haircut. Now, the point is that we do label people differently. We label people based on their presentation physically, and we also label them based on how they present to us when we have an interaction with them. The thing about labeling theory and its relationship to crime and deviance is that labeling theory argues that it's not an act itself which is deviant. So there isn't a particular thing which by definition is deviant. Something becomes deviant dependent upon society's reaction to it. So therefore, something that's deviant or criminal in one society might not be deviant or criminal in another, and something which is deemed to be deviant or criminal in one time might not be deemed to be criminal or deviant in another. In a moment, you are going to have a look at some notes, and you're going to make some notes on some labelling theorists. You're going to have a look at Becker, and you're going to have a look at Cicero in particular. And what you're going to see they argue, or Becker certainly argues, this idea that there isn't an act which is deviant, there's society's reaction to something which makes it deviant. And once that thing or that person or that individual has been labelled as deviant, then society has decided what that deviance is. That's then going to have an impact on the way in which the criminal justice system operates. Police are going to stereotype or label people in a certain way. They're going to look at certain groups of people, maybe in the way in that image of the gang with the hoods up, maybe we'd look at that and think, they maybe look like troublemakers, they maybe look like people who the police would be interested in, but that's a label that the police are attaching to those people. And what you're also going to see in the notes is that means, therefore, that crime statistics are not social facts. They're not. The statistics don't necessarily show us the exact number of crimes of that particular nature in any particular time. What the statistics do is they show us how crime has been constructed in that society. So, for example, if we suddenly legalized marijuana, if we suddenly legalized a load of drugs, then the crime statistics relating to drug offences would probably go down quite a lot. But that would just be because we had recategorized certain drugs and we had labelled something differently. So therefore that labelling process, the process through which society is deciding what is deviant or what is criminal, that is helping to construct those statistics. So from a labelling point of view, the statistics on crime are constructed by the society about which those statistics are being recorded. They are not social facts. They don't exist as something which is reliable and tangible. They are just a reflection of the society in which those statistics have been created. All right. So you're going to pause me now. You're going to use the notes, the labeling theory section of the chapter. You're going to use them to make your notes. It looks a lot like this. You've got it as a PowerPoint because it's just a scan from the textbook. So you're going to use the first 2 pages of this, the first 2 slides, to make the notes under the headings that exist on your notes template. So if you pause me now, do that, and when you've done that, come back. Okay, so hopefully now you have a decent understanding of some of the main concepts of labelling theory from Becker, from Pilliver and Bryan, from Cicero. One of the things that Cicero talks about is the way in which the police use stereotypes, or use, I guess, kind of common sense cues about people's behaviour that makes them more likely to investigate something, or to investigate somebody, than somebody else. So what they are doing in actual fact is they are applying some sort of pre-coded stereotype or label to a particular group of people based on their behaviour, and they are labelling those people as potentially criminal or potentially deviant. That's why they might stop that person, that's why they might follow that person, that's why they might investigate that person. Now, if that's the case, then that is interesting for the sociology of crime and deviance, because it means that some people, not because of necessarily any wider socioeconomic reasons. So if we think about subcultural theory, why are people more likely to commit crime? Well, they're more likely to commit crime because they're of a lower socioeconomic group. They might feel marginalised, they might feel left out of society. That's why they might have formed a subculture as a way of trying to improve their status in a different way to the legitimate way, or the mainstream way of improving their status. If you think about it from a Marxist perspective, why are people committing crime? People are committing crime because of the fact that they are suffering because of the inequality that's brought as a result of capitalism, and therefore they might need to commit crime in order to survive. If we listen to what Cicero is saying, or argued about the way in which the police maybe stereotype certain people, then what we're suggesting is that those people might not be more likely to commit crime because of the fact that they are in a lower socioeconomic group, or because of the fact that there is something materially deficient in their lives, which means that they have to commit crime. What we are suggesting is that the police might label those people, and if the police are labeling those people and they are picking on those people to investigate more than others, then what we're saying is that crime is becoming socially constructed, because it's not that these people are more criminal. There's not something in their circumstance that makes them more criminal. There's not something that makes them biologically predisposed to being more criminal. What we are saying is that the police are targeting those people, and so therefore if the police target these people, that means that they are being labelled in a certain way. So what you're going to do in a moment is you're going to watch a clip. You'll see in your notes pack there's a URL link to the clip. It looks like this, and you need to find that clip and you're going to watch it. It's about 15 minutes, and it talks about stop and search powers that the police have, and how that has a disproportionate impact on Afro-Caribbean, on black youths. Okay, and I want you to think about that, and then I want you to answer the questions underneath. So you're going to summarize the findings in the video, and then you're going to think about how that links to labeling and what we've just talked about, specifically with Cicero, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about that in a second. Okay, so pause this now and have a look at that clip. Okay, we're back. I'm aware that I keep saying we're going to go away and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about that. We're not really going to talk about it, are we? Because I'm talking and I'm communicating with you in a pre-recorded message. You can't really communicate with me. We can't have a conversation. But nonetheless, I'd like to think that you're sitting there thinking, yes, this is, I could say this or I could say that. But the point from that video that you should have got is that, Cicero talks about negotiated justice, that the justice isn't fixed, it's negotiated. Well, what we are seeing in that study of stop and search powers is that if you are black, you are far more likely to be stopped by the police. You are more likely to be charged with something than if you were a middle-class white person. So justice is being constructed, it is being negotiated. A middle-class white person might be stopped. They might have a way of explaining their behaviour which doesn't lead to any further action from the police, but the police, again using Cicero's idea of kind of common sense theories of typifications that they're looking for, stereotypes, they're looking at the black youths, and they are suggesting that in actual fact these people are more likely to commit a crime, they are doing something which is potentially deviant or potentially criminal, and so therefore by focusing on them, they are constructing deviance. So crime and deviance, the crime statistics, are socially constructed based on the way that those people are being labelled, the way that they are being stereotyped. Okay, so what we need to do this is take it a little stage further, and we need to think about what's the impact of these labels, because we're saying that, or well, not us, but labelling theorists, Cicero and Becker and others, that people are labelled in a certain way. Okay, well, what's the impact of that then? When these people are labelled, what impact does that have on their further behaviour? So you're going to need to use the next part of your notes on labelling. This time it's the third and the fourth slide that you're going to need to have a look at. And well, actually I think it's the second and the third slide that you're going to need to have a look at. I think you pick up from where you were on the previous slide. And you can see again that there is some space in your notes template to make some specific notes on primary deviance and secondary deviance and the work of Lemaire and master status and deviancy amplification, and you can see the headings you're going to make notes under. So you're going to pause, you're going to go and make those notes, and then you're going to come back and we'll talk about them. Or I'll talk about them and maybe summarize them and maybe help you to fill any gaps in your notes. So pause me now and off you go and do the next section of notes in your pack. Alright then, so the important thing about the work of Lemaire and the idea of primary and secondary deviance is that there's lots of things that people do that go unnoticed that are a little bit deviant, but it's primary deviance. It doesn't register with the rest of the population. So you might have got on the bus with a dodgy bus pass that's out of date, or it's not actually your bus pass, but the bus driver doesn't really ask to look at it properly, and you sneak on, or you go on the metro and you don't pay, and then you get off before the next stop. Or you do 35 miles an hour in a 30 mile an hour zone, but there's no speed cameras, and so therefore nobody sees it. That primary deviance isn't being labelled by anybody because nobody's really seeing it. You might know yourself that you've done it, but it's not really having any impact wider than that. You can just think, oh well, everybody does it, or you know, I took a risk, I got on the metro just for a bit of a chance and I didn't pay my ticket. It's not something that comes to define you. What Lemaire's arguing is that secondary deviance, where you've actually been labelled, where somebody goes, right, you've been caught for fraud, or you've been caught for this or caught for that, or something really serious like you've committed a murder, or you've been involved in paedophilia or something, and you've been shamed and you've been caught. That then becomes your master status, and people see you as the murderer, the paedophile, the rapist. You know, that's your master status. Other people come to see you that way, and you come to see yourself in that way as well. That becomes a status that you see. Now, we were talking earlier about, okay, so you get labelled, what impact does it have? Well, if you think about when the police are stereotyping people or labelling people, if you think right back to the start of this lesson, when we have that little image of that gang standing there with their hoods up looking a bit shifty in the park, if we are labelling people in a certain way, and we are saying, oh, you know, these people are deviant, or these people are bad for society, then there's a potential that these people start to develop those personality traits. They start to behave in that way. It becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy that we've labelled them in a certain way, and then they feel marginalised or picked on because of that label, and therefore that impacts on their behaviour. So secondary deviance can often, where something's been labelled, that can actually lead to other deviant acts. So if you look at the Jock Young case with the marijuana use in Notting Hill, and if you look at the notes you should have just made on... sent over for me and Bertie. Okay, with a slight pause there because Arthur's apparently had a chocolate egg delivered from next door, so we paused there. He was off camera just telling me about that. So this secondary deviance, this idea that this becomes your status, you know, this affects your behaviour. So Stan Cohen talks about folk devils and moral panics. People are labelled as you people are bad for society, and in some ways people almost live up to that label, and it creates more deviance because of the fact that they've been labelled in this way. So if we go back also to the video clip that you watched, if young black youths are always feeling as though they're likely to be stopped and searched by the police, if they're always feeling as though they are picked upon and picked out in a certain way, then that means that there's a potential that then has an impact on their future behaviour, so that then becomes secondary deviance. Alright? So primary deviance, something that people do, and it doesn't really have that much, nobody notices it, therefore nothing's done about it. It's secondary deviance where somebody has been labelled, and that can then have an impact on their future behaviour. Alright, so that leads us to an evaluation of labelling theory, which we'll come to in a moment. First of all, I want you to read the little bit that says evaluation. So it'll be on the third slide. It's on the right hand side of that slide. Read briefly about how we evaluate labelling theory, and even before you read it, think about what some of the advantages and disadvantages of labelling theory could be. Alright, so you should have seen from the bullet point list, I think it was on the fourth slide, not the third slide, some useful points of evaluation of labelling theory. Labelling theory is a different way of looking at crime and deviance compared with functionalism, Marxism and subcultural theory, and it's useful in the sense that it gets us to think about the way in which deviance isn't a fixed thing, and that it isn't the case that everybody is treated the same in society, and that everybody has an equal chance of being labelled as deviant, or that deviance in somehow is a neutral thing in the way that people conceive of it, because it's not. There are problems, obviously, with labelling theory that are outlined there. If we're just saying that the person that's committed the crime has just been labelled, well, that suggests that they are some sort of victim of labelling, when actually they might have perpetrated a particularly terrible crime. If we're saying that deviance doesn't really exist unless it's labelled, what about if you do something terribly criminal or deviant and nobody notices? You kill somebody and bury them under the patio, nobody ever finds out, therefore you're not criminal. Well, you are. You murdered somebody. Just because you weren't labelled as a murderer, you are a murderer. Similarly, this idea that that somehow people are labelled as deviant takes away the fact that they might have chosen to do something deviant. It might have been an active decision that they made. They weren't just a passive victim in this. And of course, labelling theory does suggest that there is some sort of power in society, and that some people are more likely to be labelled than others. But if you're looking at this from a Marxist perspective, then you'd probably say that the root of that power is not identified particularly successfully, and more needed to be done on the way in which class and race and ethnicity and gender has an impact on who's more likely to be labelled than not. What you should be able to do now, though, is you should be able to think about the way in which labelling theory is quite fundamentally different from Marxism, functionalism and subcultural theory. For example, a big criticism of labelling theory is it doesn't explain why people commit deviance in the first place, or commit crime in the first place, which is exactly what functionalism, Marxism and subcultural theory are trying to explain. So if you think about those A3 sheets that you made, where you had the key ideas of the theory, then the theorists in the middle, and then some evaluation alongside it, we talked about internal criticisms or internal evaluation of the theory. So for functionalism, you have some specific criticisms of Merton. Marxism, you have some specific criticisms of their theory. We can start to think about that column on the far side of your notes now, which is about the external criticism. Labelling theory is going to criticize functionalism and Marxism and subcultural theory. It's gonna criticize any positivistic theory that's suggesting that we can explain why crime happens, or is using crime statistics in any way to try and explain that, because of the fact that they just say that crime statistics are socially constructed. So if you think about Durkheim, Durkheim tried to prove that sociology was in fact a science, and that sociology could use, you could try and find the cause of something in a scientific way. He studied suicide, and he said, oh look, when there's not enough social solidarity in a society, it's more likely to be suicide. If you're a labelling theorist, you look at that and you go, the suicide statistics don't mean anything. They're just a social construction. They're just what the coroner in that particular society decided was or was not suicide, how they labelled that. So what you should start to be able to do now is to pick up and build up a slightly more sophisticated pattern of evaluation of the different theories, because you can not only evaluate them in terms of some specific internal criticism of that theory, but you can start to evaluate them by looking at the external evaluation. So how does labelling theory criticize functionalism? How would functionalism criticize labelling theory, for example? So we've just mentioned it. So if you were doing your labelling theory external criticisms on the right hand side of your A3 notes template, well, Marxism would criticize labelling theory for saying, okay, you've identified that some people in society are more likely to be labelled than others, but you haven't brought into the equation how important class and capitalism is in that, and how that plays a major part in deciding who is and is not labelled. Alright? So, going forward, you need to start to think about the different connection between these different theories and how you can use the different theories to criticise each other, which will be a valuable tool of evaluation moving forward. In the next lesson that we do, we'll have a look at a different theory which brings together some labelling theory and some Marxism into a theory called radical criminology or neo-Marxism. That is, however, for another day. So I hope you found this helpful. I hope you managed to complete your notes, and well done for the work that hopefully you've been sitting there doing, and hopefully that has helped you to understand labelling theory. Almost as though we were in the room being taught all together. So until next time, take care and goodbye.